This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on ASEAN at the center of India's Act East policy. The participants are Dr. Harshvardhan Pant, strategic analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the India-ASEAN relations as we commemorate 30 years of dialogue relations and 10 years of strategic partnership between India and ASEAN. We've also seen this year a number of meetings which have happened between India and ASEAN nations. Dr. Pant, when you see the ASEAN-India relationship, how far do you think this has come and how central is this to India's Act East policy?
It is very central to India's Act East policy. It is, in fact, ASEAN is at the heart of India's Indo-Pacific outreach. And we have heard from Prime Minister Modi when he addressed Shangri-La Dialogue and he laid out India's Indo-Pacific policy that ASEAN centrality will remain at the core of India's policy outreach to the region. And so we have seen ASEAN becoming pivotal not only economically but also increasingly geopolitically for India's imagination of its own strategic periphery. And so when we look at how far these relations have come, we have to assess not only the economic transformation in the relationship, but also politically how significant these relations have become and how kind of distance that the two entities, India and ASEAN, have traveled over the last few years, where economics was certainly part of the engagement, but increasingly political and geopolitical aspects have become also critical.
Dr. Pant, we've also seen that in June this year, New Delhi hosted a special ASEAN-India Foreign Ministers meeting. And it was co-chaired by the Foreign Ministers of India and Singapore. And this meeting touched on some vital issues, but a lot of people also said that RCEP maybe should also get a second look. And we remember in 2019, India pulled out. What is your take on the RCEP, and do you think this is something that India needs to take a second look at?
You know, RCEP has been, as you would recall, a lot of debate and discussion surrounding RCEP. And when India pulled out of RCEP in 2019, India had some very critical concerns about what it might mean for India's economic engagement with ASEAN. And in particular, what it might mean for China's entry into Indian market via ASEAN. And I think the meeting earlier this year that you mentioned, which was addressed by the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. Dr. Jaishankar actually pointed this out that, look, India's relations with China will have to be reassessed in light of what is happening at the border. And unlike ASEAN that had prioritized economic ties over political, India is not in a position to do that. India will take its China relations forward based on a mutual respect and mutual sensitivity about each other's national interest. And that is one of the reasons why India has been so skeptical about RCEP's ability to take forward the economic aspect of the relationship. Now, of course, what has happened is that certainly there are concerns around the economic dimension of the relationship. But also what we have seen is that RCEP has actually not delivered that kind of big-time result that it was expected when it was conceived. And we also have now competing frameworks like Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that Biden administration has pushed forward. So I think given the time that we are in terms of great power contestation between US and China, it would be very difficult to see how RCEP can be revived by India's participation or even with America's relook at it. So I think we will have to unfortunately continue to trudge along the path that we are in. But within that framework, if there are alternatives like IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has multiple dimensions and which is much wider and much broader than simply a trade arrangement. If that succeeds, then I think not only countries like India will have better economic engagement, but also Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN member states will have an alternative to RCEP, which I think is something that they have been looking for quite some time. They don't want to put all their eggs in China's basket. They also want to have alternatives.
Dr. Pant, as you mentioned China, and if we could talk a little about this, how much do you think is the influence of China when it comes to ASEAN? And do you think that also affects the ASEAN-India relationship?
Well, I think there is no getting away from the fact that China is the most important economic player in ASEAN today. And the whole idea that ASEAN had conceived at one point in time was that it wanted to benefit from all the relevant powers in the region. So when it was conceived, the idea was that America would continue to provide security arrangements, security guarantees, and ASEAN would engage with other powerhouses like China and develop an economic base and grow economically. But today what we see is that ASEAN member states are overwhelmingly dependent on China economically, and China's economic profile is very, very significant. In some ways, is becoming unsustainable because it means that the autonomy that some of these nations want to make the independent decisions is not there. And so they are looking to diversify, in some ways looking away from China. They want to have other players like India, and that is one of the reasons why countries like Singapore and Indonesia and Philippines have been explicitly articulating the need for greater engagement with an emerging power, economic power like India, because they want alternatives. And also I think the world that we are living in, where I think trade is also becoming politicized, where this argument is becoming, look, in the past we used to trade and become friends. That is not really happening anymore. We want to trade among like-minded countries. So let's trade among friends. And I think that is a concern that many in Southeast Asia have, that under the garb of trade dependence, China has militarized or weaponized that trade engagement. So you see China continues to gobble up territory in South China Sea, and there is little that ASEAN member states can do because China can play its economic power and China can use its economic muscle to get strategic and territorial gains. And I think that is what is perhaps the most concerning aspect of ASEAN today, that ASEAN is not only internally divided, but it is finding it very difficult to counter China's machinations, which are becoming very, very difficult for smaller entities. Some of the countries are very, very disturbed about it. So you have Philippines or Vietnam, for example, very concerned, very vocally concerned about it. You have Indonesia that has made its priorities clear in terms of finding an alternative to China. You also have countries like Singapore that are trying to bring in other actors so as to balance China. So I think countries are following within ASEAN different strategies. But the underlying theme is the same, that they are not really satisfied with the kind of balance of economic power that they are facing vis-a-vis China.
Dr. Pant, would you say that these internal divisions within ASEAN also get reflected in the world that we see today, where the shadow of the Ukraine crisis is looming large? Do you think it would be possible for ASEAN nations and India to form unified vision, or do you think that's maybe stretching it a little too far?
What Ukraine crisis has demonstrated is that geopolitical contestation is here to stay, that great power rivalry is only going to intensify, that big powers will use coercion of all kinds. And in fact, even before Ukraine, if there was one theater where we were witnessing great power contestation, where we were witnessing a big power trying to trample upon the rights of smaller powers, that was Southeast Asia. And China was trying to push through its own mandate on South China Sea, which was not in sync with what other countries wanted. China disregarded the arbitration tribunal's ruling on South China Sea, and which Philippines had launched, and completely ignored the ruling which went against China. So I think we were already witnessing that. I think what Ukraine has done is accelerated some of those trends and made smaller countries aware of the vulnerability that they face. So I think that is something that is likely to continue and be a factor. But great power contestation is certainly something that is going to become a big impediment for Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia and ASEAN, the whole idea around ASEAN was that they could manage two competing powers like US and China. US can provide economic stability, China can provide, US can provide military and security stability, China can provide economic stability. But that model is coming under threat now, because US and China are openly competing against each other. US has just released its national security strategy, where it has talked about China as the most important geopolitical challenge that it sees for itself. We have heard Xi Jinping talk about at the 20th Party Congress about the challenges that China is facing and how he views Taiwan as a very critical factor in the way he wants to shape China's future. And all that means that there is going to be a lot of turmoil and turbulence around Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And ASEAN, as we were discussing, is not in a position, given its internal differences, to put up a united front. So I think for India and ASEAN to put up a united front would require ASEAN to first resolve its own internal problems. India today has a very categorical and clear position vis-a-vis China. We are articulating a position that says that, look, China should resolve a border dispute with India, and then we can think of economic ties. But ASEAN, given its overwhelming economic dependence on China, is not in a position to do that, and moreover it is internally divided. So I think ASEAN will have to first figure out its own response to the kind of geopolitical contestation that is happening in its vicinity, the kind of challenges that it is facing with great powers like US and China, and then united front with India can be thought of, but at the moment it seems to be a bit premature.
Dr. Pant, as you pointed out, the influences of the US, China, and the individual relationships which each country has with these great powers also plays into organizations like ASEAN. We've seen the formation of the Quad, which is partly in response to that. Do you feel that the tensions between two nations, for example, India and China, also somewhat come in the way when India is trying to reach out to ASEAN, and the other way also, when ASEAN is trying to reach closer to India? Do you think that bilateral relations will play their role in regional organizations, and that is the practical aspect of international relations?
Increasingly now, I think, when the going is good, when things are looking positive, when at a time when China was talking about its peaceful rise, when China was more interested in economic engagement, it was relatively easy to think of a win-win outcome, as the Chinese like to call it. But today, when you have openly contested frameworks, where, as you were mentioning, a Quad is emerging partly in response to China's aggression, where Indo-Pacific as a maritime space has emerged partly because of China's assertiveness, and where countries are forming minilaterals, trilaterals, because there is no multilateral platform available in the region, then I think ultimately bilateral ties would matter, and in particular ties with China and with the US will define many of the ASEAN member states' response to what happens in the future. Some of these tensions are already quite open when you look at individual countries' response to South China Sea problems, when you look at individual countries within ASEAN, how they are responding to Taiwan crisis, for example. That is quite evident. But I think by and large, ASEAN member states traditionally had tried to shield ASEAN from this great power turbulence around. I think now, because the bilateral relations between US and China have entered a phase where it is no longer possible to ignore it, that space is no longer available. So in some ways, ASEAN has a similar predicament that India has. We both, I think ASEAN member states and India both want to focus on internal development, domestic development. We don't want to be part of great power politics. We don't want to be part of bloc politics. But the choices are becoming limited. Because if you have great powers that are competing and contesting, then inevitably you get drawn into it. And I think ASEAN, despite its member states, they have not been able to provide a uniform vision for the region. Because of their internal differences, I think bilateral leverage that countries have often can be used. And China has used that to its advantage. China has tried to create divisions, and China has tried to leverage those divisions. And that, I think, is a reality that ASEAN confronts, and India also confronts in its own ways.
Dr. Pant, we see that the External Affairs Minister was in Cambodia for the ministerial meet in August this year. And he also said that India and ASEAN also have similar views on connectivity projects dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and issues relating to cyber security. He also tweeted that a productive ASEAN-India foreign ministers meeting for a good discussion, and there's a strong convergence on Indo-Pacific connectivity, COVID-19, terrorism, cyber security, Ukraine and Myanmar. Do you feel that if we move a little away from China and the inherent conflicts which come between ASEAN, India when it comes to China, these are issues on which maybe we can seek convergence, like terrorism, COVID-19, connectivity? Do you think these are the focus areas on which we can be more optimistic?
Where great power politics is not directly impinging on some of these decisions, there is a greater likelihood of India and ASEAN framing a common response. And I think that's what we have seen, for example, during COVID and during the entire program of developing response to COVID-19. Or the question of terrorism, where countries in the region face similar predicament as India faces, where the issue of climate change and climate finance and climate adaptation is concerned, where the issue of infrastructure and connectivity is concerned. ASEAN member states don't want to rely on just China. They want multiple avenues, and India and its partners can provide those avenues. So I think there is a lot happening in terms of technology, trade, cyber, infrastructure, climate change, where the differences perhaps are not forced because of great power politics. So there is a lot that can be managed and a lot that can be worked around. And that's, I think, the intention, the things that you mentioned about External Affairs Minister pointing out. Perhaps that was the intent. There are a range of issues and factors on which perhaps the two entities can work and galvanize their relationship away from great power contestation.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on India, ASEAN, and the various issues connected with this. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on ASEAN at the center of India's Act East policy. The participants are Dr. Harshvardhan Pant, Strategic Analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.